You are innocent. You have done nothing wrong. You know exactly where you were the night in question. You have nothing to hide. Now imagine sitting in a small room with two detectives for 9 hours. No sleep, no food. Told repeatedly that the evidence against you is overwhelming. Told that your only way out, your only hope of seeing your family again, is to tell them what they already know you did. At what point do you break? Most people believe they would never confess to something they did not do. Research tells us something different. Something that fundamentally challenges how we think about guilt, truth, and justice. Today we are going to examine the psychology behind false confessions. Not opinion, not theory. Published research, and the documented cases that prove every word of it. A false confession is exactly what it sounds like. A confession to a crime the person did not commit. But within that simple definition, researchers have identified 3 distinct types, each with a different psychological mechanism driving it. The first is a voluntary false confession. This occurs when someone comes forward without any pressure from law enforcement and claims responsibility for a crime they did not commit. This happens more often than most people expect, particularly in high-profile cases, and is driven by a desire for notoriety, a delusional belief in one's own guilt, or an attempt to protect someone else. The second type is a compliant false confession. This is the most common category and the most psychologically significant. The person knows they are innocent. They know the confession is false, but the pressure of the interrogation, the sleep deprivation, the isolation, the relentless suggestion that confession is the only rational option becomes so overwhelming that confessing feels like the only way to make it stop. The person complies not because they believe they are guilty, but because the short-term relief of ending the interrogation outweighs the long-term reality of what a confession means. The third and most disturbing type is an internalized false confession. Here the person, often through sustained psychological manipulation, actually comes to believe they committed the crime. Their memory of the event is overwritten by the repeated suggestions of the interrogators. They are not lying. They genuinely believe the false version of events they have been fed. This is not science fiction. This is a documented psychological phenomenon with a body of peer-reviewed research behind it. Researchers Saul Kassin and Lawrence Reitzman, whose foundational work on confession psychology published in 1985 established these 3 categories, showed that each type requires a different set of psychological conditions to occur, but all 3 are made significantly more likely by a single variable, the interrogation technique being used. The dominant interrogation method used by law enforcement across the United States and in numerous other countries for decades is known as the Reid Technique. Developed in the 1950s by John Reid, a former Chicago police officer, it was designed around a core assumption that a skilled interrogator can detect deception through behavioral cues and use psychological pressure to extract a confession from a guilty suspect. The problem, as decades of subsequent research has demonstrated, is that both of those assumptions are flawed. Studies assessing the ability of trained interrogators to detect deception through behavioral cues consistently find accuracy rates barely above chance. A 2006 meta-analysis by Charles Bond and Bella DePaulo, reviewing over 200 studies, found that even trained professionals detect lies at a rate of approximately 54%. The baseline for random chance is 50%. Yet the Reid technique proceeds from an interrogator's subjective belief that the suspect is guilty. From that point, the technique employs a structured 9-step process designed to break down resistance. The interrogator presents guilt as certain. They minimize the moral seriousness of the crime to make confession feel less costly. They cut off denials before they can be fully articulated. They offer what researchers call a moral justification, a narrative in which confessing is positioned as the smart, rational, humane choice. All of this operates on the brain's decision-making architecture in ways the subject is rarely aware of. The interrogation room is a controlled environment. Temperature, light, time, social contact are all managed. The suspect is isolated from support. Their sense of time distorts. Their cognitive resources deplete with each passing hour, and this is where the neuroscience becomes directly relevant. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, long-term consequence evaluation, and impulse control, is highly sensitive to stress, sleep deprivation, and cognitive load. Under sustained psychological pressure, its function degrades measurably. Research by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio established that decisions made under conditions of extreme emotional stress rely less on rational evaluation and more on what he termed somatic markers, gut-level emotional signals that prioritize immediate relief over long-term outcome. In practical terms, this means that a suspect who has been in an interrogation room for 8 hours is not making the same quality of decision as someone who has had sleep, food, and legal counsel. The concept of cognitive load compounds this further. Every denial requires mental effort, constructing the denial, maintaining it under challenge, managing the emotional stress of being disbelieved. As hours pass, that effort accumulates. The cognitive resources required to maintain an accurate account of events begin to compete directly with the overwhelming desire to end the situation. Psychologist Gisli Gudjonsson, whose research on interrogative suggestibility has been cited in legal proceedings across multiple countries, identified a measurable psychological trait he called interrogative suggestibility, the degree to which a person's account of events can be shifted by leading questions and negative feedback from an authority figure. His research found that this trait is significantly higher in individuals who are young, who have lower working memory capacity, and who are in states of high anxiety. These are not rare or exceptional people. These are ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and the circumstances, isolation, sleep deprivation, sustained psychological pressure, the authority of law enforcement, are precisely those most likely to push suggestibility toward its limit. The Central Park 5 case is one of the most extensively documented examples of false confession in recorded legal history. In 1989, 5 teenagers, aged between 14 and 16, were questioned separately by New York City detectives in connection with a brutal assault in Central Park. After hours of interrogation, all 5 produced confessions. All 5 were convicted. In 2002, DNA evidence and a separate confession from the actual perpetrator exonerated all 5. The confessions, which had been the central evidence at trial, were false in their entirety. The 5 teenagers had been subjected to interrogations lasting between 14 and 30 hours. None had legal counsel present during questioning. 4 of the 5 were minors. What the Central Park 5 case illustrated, and what the Innocence Project, which has used DNA evidence to exonerate over 200 wrongfully convicted individuals, has documented repeatedly, is that false confessions are not anomalies. According to the Innocence Project, approximately 30% of DNA exoneration cases in the United States involved a false confession or incriminating statement as part of the original conviction. A confession has long been considered the gold standard of evidence in criminal proceedings. Juries and judges assign it enormous weight. The intuition driving that weight is understandable. Why would anyone confess to something they did not do? The research answers that question with precision. The same psychological mechanisms that make humans social, deferential to authority, and desperate to escape pain, the mechanisms that are in most contexts adaptive, can, under the specific conditions of a coercive interrogation, produce a confession from an entirely innocent person. Several countries have moved to address this directly. The peace model, developed in the United Kingdom in the 1990s as an alternative to Reid-based interrogation, is built around information gathering rather than confession extraction. It uses open questions, active listening, and evidence-based challenge rather than psychological pressure. Studies comparing peace to Reid-based methods find no reduction in accurate confession rates, and a significant reduction in false ones. The science is clear. A confession is not proof of guilt. It is evidence that requires the same scrutiny as any other piece of information, evaluated against the conditions under which it was produced, the psychological state of the person who produced it, and what the physical evidence independently supports. The question this research forces us to ask is not whether the justice system makes mistakes. It does. The question is whether those mistakes are built into its methods, and whether understanding the psychology can begin to change that. If this made you think differently about how the justice system works, subscribe to Mind and Motive. Every week we go deeper into the science behind criminal behavior, interrogation, and the human mind. The next episode is already on its way.